Welcome to The Explainer. Just 3 years after World War II ended, the world was already staring down the barrel of another conflict. We're talking about a moment when the Cold War almost went hot, and it all centered on one city, Berlin. This crisis pitted former allies against each other and really brought everyone to the brink.
So in 1948, this wasn't just some thought experiment. It was the terrifying day-to-day reality for 2 million people in West Berlin. They were completely trapped, caught in the very first major showdown of a brand new kind of war, a high-stakes standoff between the world's new superpowers.
So how on earth could a modern city like this be held hostage? Well, to get it, we've got to rewind a bit. Back to the end of World War II, right when that fragile alliance that won the war started to just fall apart. Okay, so after the war, Germany was basically carved up like a pie by the victors: the US, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union. Simple enough, right? Each one got a zone to occupy. But, and this is a big but, this neat little map had a huge, almost absurd complication baked right into it. And here's the kicker, the really crucial part. Berlin itself, the capital, was way deep inside the Soviet zone, over 100 miles in. And it was also split into 4 sectors. What that created was this tiny, incredibly vulnerable island of Western democracy floating in a sea of Soviet control. Just a recipe for trouble.
And yeah, that wartime alliance, it didn't last. It fractured almost immediately because the West and the Soviet Union had totally different, completely incompatible ideas about what to do with Germany.
So you had the Western powers who were like, okay, let's rebuild Germany's economy. A strong Germany means a strong Europe. But then you had the Soviet Union. They had been absolutely devastated by the war, so for them, it was about 2 things: getting massive payments, reparations, and making sure Germany could never be a threat again. 2 totally opposite goals.
And this is what's so cool about this map from '48. It's not just showing you borders, it's literally showing you the argument. On one side, you have the Western position laid out. On the other, the Soviet Union's case. It's basically a snapshot of the propaganda war that was already heating up.
So what was the final straw? It all came down to money. The tension had been simmering, and then in 1948, it just boiled over. The Western Allies introduced a new currency, the Deutschmark, to try and fix the economy in their zones. To Stalin, this wasn't just an economic move. No, he saw it as a direct threat. It was a clear sign the West was building a separate, successful Germany right on his doorstep, and he was not having it.
So, what does Stalin do? He makes a huge, incredibly risky gamble. He decided to play the one big card he held: geography. This kicked off a high-stakes chess match with the West, and the prize was the city of Berlin.
And then, on June 24, 1948, the Soviets made their move. Stalin was basically calling the West's bluff. He bet they weren't really committed to that little island inside his territory. He just cut everything: all roads, all railways, all canals, into West Berlin. Gone. The city was completely sealed off. His goal, it was brutally simple. He wanted to starve the western part of the city until it gave up, so he could take over all of Berlin.
So, what do? I mean, this put the West in an absolutely impossible spot. If they tried to force their way in on the ground, that would be seen as an act of war. And that could trigger the one thing everyone on the planet was terrified of: World War III. Okay, so land routes are out. They're trapped. So what's the answer? Well, the West looked up to the sky, and they came up with this incredibly bold, totally unprecedented plan that would really define the whole start of the Cold War. Instead of backing down, and instead of attacking, the Allies, led by President Truman in the US, decided to do something nobody thought was possible. They were going to supply the entire city, all 2 million people, completely by air.
It turns out there was a loophole. See, in all the post-war agreements, no one had ever formally guaranteed access by road or rail, but they had agreed on 3 20-mile-wide air corridors to Berlin. And the Soviets? They decided not to mess with the planes. Shooting down a Western aircraft would be a clear act of war, and even Stalin wasn't ready for that.
And you just can't overstate the scale of this thing. It was absolutely staggering. For almost a full year, planes were landing in West Berlin literally every few minutes, 24/7. They brought everything: food, medicine, and even the coal to keep the entire city from freezing to death in the winter. It was more than just a logistical miracle. It was a huge symbolic victory, a daily message of defiance that the whole world could see.
So finally, in May 1949, Stalin had to admit his gamble had failed. He lifted the blockade.
The immediate danger was gone, but the damage was done. The crisis had permanently changed the map of Europe.
And here's the ironic part. The blockade didn't bring Germany together. It cemented its division. It sped up the process of creating two separate Germanys, West Germany, which was democratic, and East Germany, which was communist. And it directly led to the creation of NATO, a military alliance specifically designed to stop the Soviets from trying anything like this again.
In this whole episode really laid out the new rules of the game for the Cold War. It showed how the superpowers were going to operate. They would push, they would pressure each other, they would use politics and economics and propaganda as weapons, but they would stop just short of actually fighting a direct hot war. Even today, historians don't totally agree on who's to blame. The traditional Orthodox view says it was all Stalin's fault, pure Soviet aggression. Then you have revisionist historians who say, hold on, the West's economic moves forced Stalin's hand. But really, where most historians land today is somewhere in the middle. They call it the post-revisionist view. It was just a toxic cocktail of mistrust and completely different goals on both sides. So in the end, this whole crisis over one city ended up defining an entire era. The Berlin airlift? It was an unbelievable success for the West, both strategically and humanly. But here's the final question to think about. In winning that battle and saving the city, did they also lock the world into the division, that iron curtain that would define the next 40 years?